Yeah, hello together to our lecture in macroeconomics. First of all, before we start with our content, I want also make again the announcement that next week we have the talk from Julia von Borstel from the Bundesbank about monetary policy. And as we also discussed in this lecture, this will be very interesting to have the view from someone from the institution of a central bank on what is now going on with interest rates, with monetary policy, and so on. Okay, and next week, then the following week, we have the talk of Lukas Nö from the Council of Economic Advisors, and he will talk about the last study of this council, which was handed to our government, I think, just around 2 weeks ago. And I think that will also be very interesting. And it would be nice if you join this talk too. This will be per Zoom. There you can then enter. I will show it also you the course of macroeconomy, the German version, and there is also the Zoom link behind, but it would be also nice if you can join in presence in our large lecture hall in the main building on Tuesday. This will be then on December 13th. Okay, then we start with our topic, and there we have the calculation of some example. And first of all, we calculated the overall equilibrium in the ISLM model when we just had the specific functions. Oops. That we have given: consumption, investment, and government expenditure, and also the money demand and money supply. With this, we came to this overall equilibrium. And then we posed the question, what happens to this overall equilibrium if we make fiscal policy or if we make monetary policy? And the fiscal policy, I think we already had, that we calculated the ones with the multiplier of the government expenditure when we double the government expenditure here from 20 to 40. This just means that we have to redo the calculation just only with G equals 40 and not 20. And from this, we obtained a multiplier of 1.25. And this, of course, then we can also put in our picture of the overall equilibrium. And we have a look at it. What is the only change in our diagram? The only change in our diagram is just that we have this shift to the right of our IS curve, and this now means that on the horizontal axis we start not at 500, but we start, compared to this here, we start at 600. So what we obtain is just this shift from 500 to 600, and this would be then the new IS curve. And here we have then the expansion. I think this was then afterwards 450 and 10%. Yes, here we have the fare for 450 and the 10% now equilibrium interest rate. So this would be then 10% and this 450, and this is then new equilibrium after fiscal policy, and we had risen delta G was plus 20, and then we obtained a new. I take now the subscript G, IG star at 10% and YG star equaled 450. Well, and then, of course, we will also, why this always happens here? I don't know. How do I get rid of this? No. This one. Okay. And now we want to make our, where is it? Monetary policy that we in B increase our quantity of money by 25%. So since we afterwards also want to show this in the diagram, now we take here monetary policy. Policy increase of M by 25%. Well, also we can then just start from our overall equilibrium. Where did we have this? This was here. Again, let's cut this. And let's take this one. Oops. Ah. So, copy. Oh. Copy and paste. So, what happens if we increase money, aggregate money by 25%? What does this mean? Let's take this in blue. What happens then? M will be increased by 25%. Where did we have M? We have M just here, 400. 25% of 400 are plus 100. So we obtain delta M equals 25% times M is 1/4 times 400 is 100. So in the IAS curve, of course, nothing changes, but here we have to insert plus 100. Then we obtain 500 over 2, this is 250. We had to multiply this by 2. So the new LM curve is then just here plus 100, and then we obtain new LM curve to be 500 plus 500 I equals Y. And what do we have to do then? Yep. Yes, we have this parallel shift to the right of the LM curve. And in order to obtain the new equilibrium, what again do we have to do? Yes, of course. Again, LM equals IS. And then we obtain now 500 plus 500I equals the old IS curve, 500 minus 1500 times I. Then we see something surprising. These two cancels, and then of course we have that 500I equals, 2000I equals 0, and this means that our equilibrium interest rate is 0. And this, of course, therefore I used these numbers just in the recent history. We definitely had these 0 interest rates. Well, right now interest rates start to rise again, but if you look at the last 10 years, we had more or less 0 interest rates. Let's call this IM star. How do we obtain then the new equilibrium income? What do we have to do? Yep. Yes. Yeah, so we can insert in the S curve or we insert in the LM curve. And then, of course, we have here 500 minus 1500 times 0% is 500, and of course 500 plus 500 times 0% is also 500. And let's put this also in our new picture. You also already mentioned this. This means just a parallel shift. Now LM is starting at these 500, and then we have here 0% and IM star, and 500 is YM star. So here you have this parallel shift and this positive impulse of monetary policy on the output. So delta Y or delta Y is then Y star M minus Y star, and Y star we had 425, so it's 500 minus 425 is 75. Okay, then we are ready with our ISLM model, and now we want to switch to relax the next assumption which we made in the ISLM curve. Remember, from the pure Keynesian commodity market, there we had fixed prices and only the commodity market. Now we inserted also the money market and interest rates, but still prices were fixed, and therefore now we want to relax from this assumption, and we want to assume that we now have partially flexible prices. Well, we won't assume in this stage that prices are totally flexible, because still we have the argumentation that especially in the labor market there are some price rigidities, that this adjustment process from full competition and perfect markets we do not see in practice. Well, and if we have these price rigidities, then we can assume that we have still some market power in the markets by the enterprises. And this means if these markets are still not fully competitive, that they can charge a price a little bit over the price of total competition, where we would say that prices have to be equal with marginal costs. I don't know, maybe you have dealt in other lectures with other forms of competition, like an oligopoly structure, where you have only some firms and some maybe also monopolistic competition. And there is always the result that you do not have prices is marginal costs. This is in full competitive markets. This comes just from profits is revenue minus costs, and if you take the optimum derivative of profits, then equals 0, then this would mean P equals marginal costs, the first derivative of the cost function. And here we assume that markets are still not fully competitive, and this means that we assume that you can charge a price P is mu plus marginal costs, and this would be then the markup over full competitive prices. Well, and also remember, within our ISLM curve, we have already introduced the variable P, where we calculated, where we come from nominal amount of money to real amount of money. And so we will, from this assumption that we have still some rigidities in the market, we will deduce an aggregated supply curve, which is dependent on prices, and from our demand-driven model, the ISLM model, from this model we will deduce our aggregated demand. So this AS curve, we want to derive the dependence on prices of aggregated demand in a qualitative way, and there are mainly three explanations. And the first is the Keynesian theory of rigid wages, the Keynesian theory of, in general, not only in the labor market, but we also assume that there are also some other commodities where the adjustment process is not that fast as we need it in full competitive markets. And then there's also a theory about expectations, which could also explain the dependence of supply on prices. Let's start with rigid wages. What do we assume then? Well, of course, always we think that enterprises are profit maximizers. What does it mean if wages are constant in the short run? We have again profits equals revenue minus costs. And here we have as one of the main cost components, we have one of the main components is the wage. And now think of a situation where prices increase. So here we have P times X and here we have C of X, and in this C of X we have our VW for wages. And now if we assume that a main part of our cost side stays constant, while on the other side this one is rising, then we could argue, due to the fact that I can sell my products for higher prices, but my costs are not directly adjusting in the same way, that I have an incentive to increase my production. So revenue is rising, costs are not rising that fast, and this means then that I have an incentive to increase my production. And if I go then to my whole economy, that there is a reasonable amount of enterprises which can do this, then we obtain altogether that aggregated supply increases if P prices are increasing. So we obtain then a dependence which is, so to speak, positive. This means, of course, also the other way around. If prices would decrease, then also my costs will be the same. Then I have an incentive to reduce my production. So the other way around, if prices would decrease, I would also decrease my production. Well, then we can also expand this argumentation, that we not only say that wages are in the short run constant, but also the prices of some other goods should also be quite rigid in the short run. And now we have to distinguish between two things: a general price level, for example, measured in the consumer price index, and my single price of my product, what I am selling in my company. So then it could be the case that the price level, consumer price index, is falling. But there could be, due to rigidities, some enterprises which do not reduce their own prices of their own goods. So this price here is, of course, different from the price level. So this is the single price of one enterprise. So, and these prices should be rigid, as we have assumed in the short run. So what does this mean now? This means now that they do not reduce their prices, but we have a general reduction in the price level in our economy. And this would then mean, since I am too expensive now, because I want to sell still for the higher prices, that my revenues are falling. Since the own prices are compared to the price level in the economy is too high. So, and if my revenues are falling, then of course I have also to reduce my production. And then again, going to the aggregate variable of total output, this would then mean that if the price level in my economy is falling, that in general also I can assume that the total production is falling. Then again, Ys is falling if prices are falling. And this, of course, then again means that we have here still this positive dependence, because this means also the same argumentation would also be that I would increase my production if prices are rising. Here we just made the argument the other way around, that we here made the argument when the price level is falling. And the last explanation, also I think really important, that because we see in the development of macroeconomic variables, the expectations are highly relevant. Also our expectations, where are moving the energy prices, are highly relevant. What is my consumption tomorrow? So, and there we also think that we have no perfect foresight into the future, that I make some mistakes with my expectations. And what we assume here, again, that we once have a look at the price level in our economy, CPI, and my own price in my company. And what we assume is that we cannot distinguish if price level is falling. Does this mean that also the prices in my branch are falling? Or if my price development in my branch is something has another development? So I cannot distinguish relatively what is the change in general price level and how is how does this depend on my own relative prices compared to this general price level in the economy. And if I cannot distinguish this, then we also again try to argue what happens if the general price level, again, CPI, is falling. Now we could think of a situation that I interpret this situation because in general prices are falling, that also my own prices have relatively fallen. And if I assume this, although my own prices doesn't have changed, then of course I also start to reduce production because of my misspecified expectations. And also we could take the view of the workers in the company. They also can assume, well, price level overall has fallen. And that due to this, my nominal wages has fallen. But then it could be also the case that I misspecified, that I see, well, I'm not earning 1,000 euros per month, but only 900. But what counts is how much goods I can buy for this 900. And if prices has fallen 1-to-1, like my own wages, then nothing should have changed in my consumption behavior. But if I misspecify this, that I do not realize, okay, overall prices has fallen, my wages had fallen, and I can buy still the same amount. I see only not 1,000, but only 900 euros per month. What will I do? I will reduce my labor input. And if I, in general, reduce my labor input, of course, overall production in my economy will also be reduced, and we again obtain the dependence that total supply will fall if prices are falling, and again we have the same direction of the movement of prices and supply, so Ys of P is still this positive dependence. And in that way we have three explanations in order to obtain something which you have seen hopefully in many other lectures, that in general we have the dependence and increasing supply dependent on prices. So now we have, so to speak, characterized our overall supply side depending on prices in our economy. And the next step, we want to derive the overall demand curve. And this overall demand curve we will derive from the ISLM model. Remember, this is our demand-driven model. And what we now do is just that we put our commodity market, the IS curve, together with our LM curve from the money market, but now this P will be flexible. This P can adjust. Remember, from setting IS equal LM, we obtained an equilibrium output. But of course, this equilibrium output is dependent on a specific price level. We didn't talk about this because in the ISLM model, we assumed that prices are fixed. But now these prices can change. And what happens if these prices change? Everything else should be constant. This just means that the real amount of money decreases. Well, and now think of the money market. What happens in the money market? If real amount of money decreases, then supply of money decreases. So we obtain a shift to the left of money supply. And if this shifts to the left, we also obtain a left shift of the LM curve. Just the other way around as we had it in the example we started today in our lecture. So now we have a shift to the left of the LM curve, and this of course would then mean that equilibrium income depending on prices would decrease, and overall we then obtain this negative dependence. Let's have a look here also in our diagram. So what happens? We have from the money market P and X, not P and X, sorry. Interest rates, money supply and money demand. And this was supply M over P. If now P is increasing, then M over P is decreasing, and this means we obtain here a shift to the left. If we have here this shift to the left, then this translates in a left shift of LM. So let's say P1 is larger than P0. LM of P1. Well, let's take the starting point. The starting point was that we have an equilibrium income depending on our starting price level P0. And this now can be again translate similar to our derivation of the LM and the IS curve in a classical price quantity diagram. We put this starting equilibrium depending on P0 as our first possible point where we have this dependence of income on our starting price level. If we now increase our price level from P0 to P1, LM is shifting to the left. This means now we have a new Y star of P1 reduced. This we also put in our price quantity diagram. But this corresponds now to a higher price level P1. So maybe we have here our higher price level. So we obtain a new point of coordinates in price quantity diagram where a smaller income corresponds to a higher price. And then again, this argumentation has to be made with all possible price levels. And what we then obtain is, of course, some point above and below, and then we have to move to all possible prices, and what we then obtain is this falling aggregate demand curve. We obtain a falling aggregate demand curve in prices. Well, and then of course we put this together. Our increasing supply, our decreasing demand, and what we obtain in the intersection is again our overall equilibrium in our economy, where some output is corresponding to a specific price level. But you have to be careful. Of course, this looks like a classical market diagram as you have seen it quite often, prices and quantities. But the derivation of the supply and the demand curve is, of course, in a other way than you just have it if you look at your individual demand coming from utility maximization, from your preference, or from the supply side where you just say, well, I have my profit maximization of my firms. Especially we had this argument about expectations in the supply side, and of course this aggregate demand curve comes from this total ISLM model with then flexibilized prices. So sometimes if you have a look in the internet, then it's just said, well, let's have a look at this, and this is nothing like microeconomics. Well, it is definitely something different, because the arguments which are behind the supply curve and the demand curve are much different to this micro view, which when you look just at one good in some market. And then we could also ask ourselves, well, what will happen if we totally flexibilize our prices? Because especially for the AS curve, we still argued for the derivation that there are some price rigidities. Well, if we think that prices are totally flexible, what does this mean? This means that our price adjustment process is very, very fast. That prices can directly adjust. And if prices can directly adjust, then this means we do not make any mistakes in our expectations. Then this would mean that our expected prices will coincide with the real prices. Well, and if this is the case, then of course production can only depend on the framework, on the circumstances in our economy. And what is meant by this framework? By this framework, we mean what you are right now doing. What is the level of education in our economy? How smart are our people? How good is our infrastructure in our economy? What kind of natural resources do we have? And in general, we call this the level of technology. So to speak spoken, we could say, how good can we produce? Everything else, the price adjustment process for the for the equality of demand and supply. Now we have totally flexible prices. And then our supply will only depend on this framework. And this possible output we call then the so-called natural output. Output. Sorry. And compare this with potential output in the business cycle, because this is more or less the same argumentation, that in the long run we have some potential output, and in the medium and in the short run we are above or beneath our potential output. But in general, we always will move to our potential output, or also it's called the natural output. Well, and if this is the case, then we would have in the long run just a vertical supply curve, because this does not depend anymore on prices. Is not depending anymore on prices. It depends only on the level of technology. And this is then, so to speak, the first part where we talk about the neoclassical view on the economy. This we will talk afterwards, after this ASAD model, then in general, what is neoclassical theory about. But one result of the neoclassical theory is that we have a supply side driven economy, and that in general we only depend in the supply side on the natural output. And if this is then this vertical supply curve, then we see that what we can reach in our economy is just only driven from the supply side. Okay, but then what we want to do is now the same as in the ISLM model. Now we will also talk what happens in case of monetary policy and what happens in case of fiscal policy. And there we will start in the short or medium run perspective in the ASAD model. So at first we will assume that this AS curve and this AD curve is relevant, and in the end we will then make also some dynamical argumentation that we think that in the long run our supply is shifting to this vertical curve. So let's start. We start, of course, from our ISLM model. And there we think that we in our overall equilibrium. So here, oops, no, starting in overall equilibrium. So what happens at first? Fiscal policy if government expenditure is rising. In the ISLM model, what happened? We had it in the beginning of the lecture today in our example. What happened there? If you look at this diagram, which curve is shifting? Not with M's. Now we want to start with fiscal policy. So this was then let's jump to this diagram. This was more or less the first diagram we started today. This was this one. We had plus delta G of 20, and this meant that we have here a shift of the IS curve to the right. Okay? Okay, great. So if we have this shift to the right of the IS curve, what happens then? So shift to the right of the IS curve. But this means that income is increasing. The equilibrium point here is shifting to the right. Income is increasing. But then, of course, we have to go now, since we have flexible prices set, starting from this point here, that due to the AS curve, also prices will increase. But now, due to the AS curve, prices will increase. But what happens if prices increase? We just argued, prices enters our ISLM model at the money market. This means real amount of money is decreasing. Real amount of money is decreasing, and this means also the LM curve has to shift to the left. We argued just some minutes before. So this means LM to the left. But what does mean if LM is shifting to the left from the derivation of the AD curve? We know that a shift to the left of the LM curve means also a shift to the right of the AD curve. So then AD curve shifts to the right. So at first, so to speak, we move out here. This would be the pure change of the ISLM model, but then we have a backshift of income due to the increase of price level. So then we would move here in a new equilibrium y star prime p prime or p1. And then what happens in the long run? In the long run, the vertical supply curve AS long is relevant, and therefore in the long run prices are now fully flexible. We would move back to our natural output, then step backward to natural output and only a higher price level. So in the end, we would be then in a situation that our fiscal policy is totally absorbed by inflation. And this is more or less the classical argument again. Please do not intervene in our markets because our private companies, we ourselves, the household, can do it always better than the government. Well, let's do also now our monetary policy. What happens again if we do monetary policy? So plus delta M, an increase of aggregated money. Again, of course, we start from our ISLM model because nominal amount of money is only entering our model in the demand side. So what happens in this case? Plus delta M, an increase of nominal amount of money. Here? Yep. Yes, again, we had it just, I think, an hour ago at the starting point of our lecture today. Then shift of the LM curve to the right, to LM prime. But again, and this is the similar argumentation in fiscal policy, we have this shift here. So income is increasing. But again, due to AS, due to the AS curve, this implies an increase of price level. So at the first step, we have an increase of the nominal amount of money. And this triggers now an increase of price level. Prices are also entering our demand side of our model in at which market? In the ISLM model, where do we find these variable prices? Yeah. Yes, yeah, below there. And so if we now have a higher price level, this means that real amount of money is decreasing, M over P. And what does this trigger? Which curve is now shifting? I think, where did we have it? Here. This was when we made the derivation of our AD curve. This is the shift of money supply due to a higher price level. And this meant what shifted here in our ISLM model when we had this price increase. Yep. Price increase means net. Yes. So what's happening there? At first, we have this push of our economy at constant prices. But now prices are increasing due to the AS curve, and this means we have a backshift of our LM curve. First, this large shift outside, then prices are starting to rise, so we obtain a backshift of the LM curve. Increase of price level, and this means a backshift of LM curve to the left to LM double prime. Well, and a backshift of the LM curve. Overall, we have this slight outward shift, means then also a slight shift of AD to the right. And then we would have here our medium run equilibrium in the AS-AD model with a slightly higher output. This would be again the total shift in income due to the ISLM model, but this is at constant prices. Since we have the price increase, this is then going back to this a bit lower level of total income. At higher income and higher prices. So, and then in the long run, again, vertical supply AS long is relevant, and so income moves back to natural output and a higher price level. So then we move here and we are back again in the situation that, well, maybe we have in the short run a little impulse on our income, but in the end, we are just in a situation, if nothing in our framework, in our society has changed, that we are just in the situation of inflation. Well, and what process is also behind this? Think of the argumentation due to the quantity theory of money. This just meant if you increase the amount of money, that this translates in a one-to-one upward shift of prices. And this we have here also if we here think of a long run supply curve which is only depending on, which is not depending on prices. This is then also more or less already the neoclassical view on our economy. Okay, then let's summarize this. When my file has saved. That we at first can say, well, in the short or medium run, we still have a positive effect. In the ASAD model on input, on income, but compared to our ISLM model, this impact of fiscal and monetary policy is reduced. And why is it reduced? Well, this was the total impact if prices do not adjust, and then prices adjust, and so to speak, then this price adjustment absorbs some part of our positive impulse of the increase of money amount. And also in this case, we would have at first at constant prices this total shift, but again some of this total shift is also absorbed by the increasing prices. And then we have to admit, in the long run, if we have our vertical supply curve, then this would mean that only prices would increase. And this is quite often the argumentation of neoclassical economists. Well, if we put it into the actual situation, I would say that we have to admit that we always have in the actual situation somewhere some rigidities, and that the assumption of perfect markets, of full competition, perfect competition, this is okay, but this is only the case in the long run. And if we take, for example, the last 10 years, then I would say in our actual situation, we are just more or less in this kind of step where we say the short or medium run view was quite long the relevant one. So all our impulses via monetary policy from the ECB and our fiscal packages during the financial crisis, during the Corona crisis, think also about the short-term work which we had in during especially the Corona crisis. All this worked. more or less, to come through this crisis. But then now, roughly spoken 1 year ago, prices started really to increase. And not only because of the war in Ukraine. The movement of prices started much earlier. It was so in summer, autumn 21. And what I think is that we still are in the situation that we more or less think we can go on steering our markets via the ECB and via fiscal policy. And that now we have the reaction, the long run reaction of markets. That if you always intervene, that then at some time really the prices will start to rise if you do not change the circumstances. If we do not invest in education, in infrastructure, then it is not possible for us to produce more in the long run. If this circumstances doesn't change, if we just only say, well, everybody gets another 1,000 euros, nobody can become unemployed, there is no insolvency of enterprises, then of course at some time I think markets must react, and that we should not be surprised that we have this rise in prices right now, because it is maybe in this situation here that within our overall model, at first we had only a moderate increase of prices due to this positive slope of the aggregated supply curve, but in the long run this slope of the supply curve will be steeper and steeper and steeper. Well, what we also did here right now is that we somehow argued in a time dynamical way. This happens first, and then this happens, and then this happens. But we have also to be careful. Right now, up to now in our model, we do not find somewhere a time variable. So actually then, due to our analysis, we must say that more or less all effects will happen simultaneously. And this would be then the next step in such a model, that you start to dynamize it and that you introduce a time variable. But this is then a bit more what we can do in an introductory course in macroeconomics. But what we can say then overall, what would be more or less a good economic policy, what will be good governance, is then of course that if we take this picture here again, AS, AD and natural output, then of course in general we have to increase the technology of our economy. Only printing money or just saying, well, next month everybody gets 1,000 euros. And the argumentation behind this, if we have more income, then we start to buy things, will not work in the long run. And I don't think that we will come with, again, very high fiscal packages or with some impulse from the ECB again through the next crisis, because now we are in the situation that we already are in a situation with very high inflation rates. And if we would now put the next push via fiscal policy or monetary policy, I would think that then even prices will increase much more. Okay, then we are done today with our ASAD model, and the last part of the lecture will be then the neoclassical theory. Thank you very much for today.